Ladies and ladies, no, not gentlemen yet, welcome to our roundtable discussion, and we have titled this Do You Speak My Language? And with this session we celebrate UNESCO's Year of Indigenous Languages, and we have here four academics coming around the world. Diane Hirshberg, Professor Diane Hirshberg from University of Alaska, Anchorage, the US, and then we have Kalpana Vijayavarathan, yes, from, sorry about that, from University of Faroe Islands, and then we have Professor Burke from Memorial University of Newfoundland from Canada. And then Dr. Suvi Lakkala from University of Lapland, Finland. And this group of people, we come together with this Team U Arctic thematic network on teacher education for social justice and diversity. This is an international circumpolar network. We have currently 25 members in our thematic network, and we have three themes which we are especially interested in. One is distance management and how we provide equal and good quality education despite of the distances we have in the Arctic area. The other one is inclusive education, how we make education accessible for all, and how we meet the individual needs and the diversity of what we have in our areas. And then one is the third one is indigenous pedagogies. Arctic area is rich with indigenous population and peoples. There are many, and we will hear about them in this roundtable discussion. And the procedure goes so that every speaker, this is a discussion, but we have four separate discussions, and they are each led by one of his colleagues here. And they first, just with few minutes, explain what is the topic and what is the theme they want to discuss. And then we have discussion. And I have a timer here. And when the time is up, this will say something, ring or something, and then we change the topic. Okay. So this is meant to be very relaxing discussion between academics and how we see indigenous people, indigenous languages, and inclusive languages, young people and children in our Arctic areas. And then we start. Anne, you are the first one to lead our discussion, please.
Thank you. So the work that we've been doing in Canada is looking at early ages, early learning, and we've been really looking and focusing on what can we do for young Indigenous children in the near north and the Arctic, meaning what can we do for them for preparation for school, for them to come to school, but also how do we help to recognize that the learning that's currently taking place in their own homes and families is most important, and that we don't want to bring our westernized perspectives on how we teach reading and writing in a classroom in a city to a place that's rural, where they have a rich experience of their own that is very close to the land, that's very close to how their parents and how their grandparents share language and experience with them. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about more and just sort of maybe do a little bit of reading so that you'll get an idea where I'm coming from. Indigenous ways of learning have significant influence over the development of respective languages and cultures. And indeed, Indigenous learning has been considered to be spiritual and a holistic process, which is quite apart from isolated acquisition of knowledge associated with a strictly Eurocentric and historical approach to teaching and learning, which is the way that we are currently teaching teachers in Canada and teacher education programs. So we have completely neglected an understanding of how Indigenous educators work with children in their classrooms. Despite the above, there are current learning paradigms and pedagogies, ways that we do teach, that are relevant and consistent with Indigenous approaches to teaching and learning. My area is play-based learning. I look at how children can learn through play in classrooms. Currently, the debate in the US as well as Canada is that play-based learning does not teach children how to read and write. In our initial look across the Canadian Arctic, we have realized that a lot of play-based learning and outside learning, as well as land-based learning that is currently used by Indigenous peoples, such as forest kindergarten and learning in the forest, is something that's very important. It's because it's hands-on and it's a learning experience that's quite valued and traditional, and one that they feel comfortable with. In Canada, we are now trying to look at what does it mean for children to learn in a place that is familiar to them, in a location that is outside, that is forest-based, that allows for them to learn the traditional knowledge that is responsive in practice, and also makes them feel as if they have control over what they need to learn. So for us, public education, and as well as working with teachers, has been quite a challenge. And to be truly respectful to Indigenous populations in the North and the training of teachers, we have offered an Indigenous education program for primary and elementary teachers that is very grassroots born, very much based on what teachers in those communities want to learn. And part of what they want to learn is they want to make sure that children are valued for their identity, for what they see as being very important in the ways that they learn their ancestry. So that is something that we have come to focus on in delivering a Bachelor of Education, Primary, Elementary, and Indigenous Education, one of the first in Canada through Memorial University. My question today that I would like for us to have a larger conversation about with early childhood and looking at teacher education and what do teachers really need to know in working with young children. So I've asked the question, what culturally inclusive and responsive programs and or pedagogies, the way in which we teach, are available to support the development of Indigenous language, how children speak their traditional language, language that's used at home with their parents and their grandparents in school settings. So what are the challenges currently in the country where you reside? What are some practices that are going on that could be learned and shared today? Thank you, that is my question.
Okay, so now, what do you think?
Well, if I talk about Finland first, indigenous cultures and teaching indigenous pedagogies is not my special field, but
children are.
Yes, they are. And as far as I know, in Finland, it's a problem to address these kinds of, for example, teacher programs and also teaching for Sami people because of the low density. Yeah, so there are so few people. For example, 70% of Sami students under 7 are nowadays living in the south, or at least outside the Sami homeland region. So that sets a lot of.
So they're like Canadian children. They're living in cities.
Yeah,
Okay.
mostly.
Yes.
Mostly, yes. But luckily, our curriculum guidelines are set in a way that Finnish schools have the possibility to locally implement some cultural features. And I know that, for example, in the north, the indigenous people's cultural features can be taken into account. And for example, in Sodankylä, where I have visited, there are land-based and nature-based things that the children are taught to, and they can go to reindeer gatherings, for example, because that's most of their parents' way of living and so on. So in that way, there are some kinds of possibilities, but we don't have enough teachers who are bilingual, for example, or I think that in Finland we are just now beginning to wake up.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that it doesn't need to be indigenous. I think that the whole, especially in North Finland, it's a very land-based living, and if the teacher comes from south, it's very or from the city, it's very different way of living. How about in Alaska?
So in Alaska, we face many of the same challenges as the Canadian regions that you're working in. We have very, very few Indigenous educators. We don't have teacher education programs broadly that are working on Indigenous pedagogy. Well, we have some, but it's I would say in early childhood it's probably our strongest area, but it's for one region. We have a tribal college called Ilisagvik up in Utqiagvik, the far north, and they have a 2-year associate's degree for early education teachers, and it's in the Nubak language. So, but and you'll see later a map of Alaska, but we are so spread out and have so many languages, and most of our educators are prepared in a very Western structure, and so even to really integrate Indigenous pedagogies and epistemologies, even without language, can be quite difficult. But we are doing right now. We have a set of we have the cultural standards for educators that were created through our Alaska Native Knowledge Network, and were finally, many years later, adopted by our State Board of Education. I'm involved in a project that is adapting them for an early learning setting, because they are very much a elementary and secondary level. And we have actually just finished the draft, and we're working with a Yupik immersion early learning setting, so 0 to 3, to pilot utilizing these standards and trying to measure what it looks like for educators, some of whom are Indigenous and some of whom are not. So we're slowly getting there, but it's a really important challenge that we need to be working on.
How about in Faroe Island? That's a very different context.
Very different.
Yeah.
Because we don't have any indigenous people. But then the Faroese nationals feel they're remote because they're stuck in the middle of the North Atlantic. For those of us who do not know, the Faroe Islands belong to Denmark, but are situated in the North Atlantic. And Faroese people have always lived very close to nature. And they want this taken back into the culture. I mean, globalization has also meant that aspects of Faroese culture have been put in the shade. So 2 things they've done recently. One is that they have outdoor kindergartens, which encourage this kind of communication with nature, discovering yourself through activity, to see the natural landscape is very much a part of your identity. The other one, which has raised some controversy, is that they have now started to have a public butchering of a cow, and the children can go and see, so they know where the meat comes from. So 2 sections of the spectrum, which I reserve my judgment on the latter. But for the former, the Department of Education also has the Department of Social Educators, and we train them specifically to work in kindergarten, keeping this in mind, that the identity and the role of the child in society must be close to that which is close to their parents and so on. So they have a tradition that they can lean back on.
Lovely. That is something that's so important. One of the things, the last time that I was here in Finland, I had the opportunity to visit a Sami preschool. It was a very special day. When we arrived, it was Janetta and I that went. The children were hiding in their I think it was their tent, their summer tent, and we heard these little laughter. And then we had a joyful day learning about reindeer herding, but also remember they were preparing for summer camp and what food they would eat, and they had much to share with me. It taught me a lot about what's missing in Canada. I mean, we have land-based, but they're very metro-based, meaning they're in urban cities. You know, it's about being outside and learning what you can grow and what it comes from. But the natural experience of what they were sharing was something I think that really needs for in teacher education to be taught. Okay, you may not have that. You might have ancestry, like I have Indigenous ancestry, but I do not have lived experience. So if you have not had that experience, then you do need to have that experience in other ways. So I think that's something that's really, really important.
And I think that for all kids and for everybody, actually, the connection with the nature means that then you want to look after it. So it's all the education for sustainability for that.
Yes.
So if you have never been out in the nature, so it's not yours.
Yes.
Or you don't belong there.
No, not a disconnect. You know, it's a big word in North America. Disconnect.
Yeah, I think that in Finland, the matter of indigenous people is quite delicate right now. And I remember one of my colleagues who teaches Sami pedagogies or Sami culture in our university, right now is in mother leave. She told me that one course that was about Sami culture, the students were a little bit afraid of. They had asked her, what about, because what can I say about Sami culture and languages, because I'm not an indigenous person myself. So what you said about, although I'm not experienced myself the kind of culture, it would be important to get that kind of experience.
It is, and what you talk about, the social practice and that type of pedagogy and teacher education is so important.
I think it's getting back to the basics, and in this instance, it's both a grassroots movement and top-down for the department, which is a good combination, I think.
One of the other pieces, of course, with early learning settings is, I think in Nordic countries, there's generally universal access to early education. We don't have that. In Alaska, we've got programs that are for children from low-income families or children with special needs. But if you are the parent of a child who was 3 years old and they don't fall into those categories, you have to pay privately. So many children just don't get early education experiences. So that's on top of not having a great deal of sort of cultural-based programs. On the other hand, this is in the urban areas. Of course, in the villages, we have people who are living traditional lifestyles still, who are in subsistence lives. So they are connected to nature. They are hunting and gathering and subsisting, and so children are raised running around fish camp and being around that. So in that sense, they're getting early learning experiences that could never be
very
provided.
valuable. Yeah.
But it also means that children, I always struggle with this because I think every child can learn and they develop at different points, and so who cares if they didn't learn to read and write when they were 3, because they'll learn when they're 5 or 6 or 7.
7.
Yes. But we are very stuck on assessing kids' abilities and preparation for school when they are 4 or 5. So it's yes.
Okay, I think that we in Finland we have a different kind.
Yes.
point of view.
Oh,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
I come here and I kind of sigh because it's much more advanced.
And I think that with those kind of outdoor activities, the children learn, young children learn many very valuable things, and they learn about culture, they learn about language, and then the reading and writing is just
It
not
comes
important.
naturally.
It comes.
It
Yes,
comes
yes.
naturally. I
Yes.
see that each day when I go over to visit at the research center where we work, and we're outside and children are counting and they're making letters, or
Mhm.
they're they're
Yeah.
doing things that make meaning to them.
Yeah.
That's important.
Using all their senses.
All of
Yes.
their senses.
Yeah.
And the learning in context that is so valuable.
Yes.
So
To
if they,
anchor.
if they have the reader which comes from Washington DC and which has the animals or things that they have never seen,
Right.
so it doesn't make sense. But if they are with their family and they do important family things, and there
Yes.
they do for sure they learn the important words they read
Yeah.
as well. So that's, I think that's very, in our educational system, it's that's not bad. Okay, here we go. Yes, thank you. Then next, Kalpana, please.
Yes, thank you. As I said, I'm from the Faroe Islands, and I'm going to look at this issue from dual perspectives. The first being that Faroese in itself is a minor language. It's spoken actively by 50 or 1,000 people within the Faroe Islands, and roughly 18 to 20,000 outside the Faroe Islands. So there's a deep consciousness of maintaining the purity of the language, of not letting the language fall prey to modern trends of globalization in terms of adopting English, because Danish is a constant presence in the Faroes. Our Faroese children, they begin with Faroese in grade 1, obviously, and Danish is introduced in grade 3 and English in grade 4. And of course, they have the same situation where when they go to higher secondary, grades 11 and 12 and 13, Danish textbooks dominate. And then they go on to university, it's Danish and English textbooks. So there's this great need to preserve the language, and an understandable need. And there's a great movement towards publishing textbooks for primary schools and not yet for higher secondary. And in the meantime, what has happened is English has diluted the interest in Danish, which means now we have a generation of students who are not able to cope with having Danish textbooks in the higher secondary. So it's a very complex issue. And that comes from the Faroes being the small language it is. By necessity, the Faroese are multilingual, and they're pretty competent in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. They have a very good language resource. And that is one side of the story. There are always two sides to a story. So I'm looking at it, the other perspective I'm looking at is how do we equip children and others who come into the Faroes as immigrants to integrate through language. Language is a key tool. It is not the only tool, but it's a key tool. As of now, we don't have an official integration policy. We have a kind of a hybrid system that we copy from Denmark, which is quite punitive when it comes to language learning. And by that I mean you have to achieve certain goals in language to be able to be given permanent residence, for example. And the Faroes, for obvious reasons, given the political relationship with Denmark, wanted to adopt that approach. And nothing wrong with that. But the problem is, if we are going to demand of the immigrant children and adults that you learn Faroese, then there has to be language teaching, Faroese language teaching. We do not have formal Faroese language teaching, and it depends on which part of the Faroes you enter. You have a guaranteed 30 hours of Faroese teaching, which is not a lot to learn a language. And then you have school children who have some of the language as the mother tongue and Faroese as second language, and you give them about 9 hours in a year of additional Faroese teaching, which is if you are lucky enough to be in one of the schools that have the resources. The other side of the coin, which is quite ugly, I think, is we don't take time to create a culture that says, let us use also what the immigrants come with, so that they can add to the resource of the country. These are tax-paying citizens, and their children have a right to education, because the education law is very, very clear. Each and every child is entitled to quality education. So where are the immigrant children in this picture, or the adults for that matter, to integrate into society? There is an integration policy and immigration policy in the pipeline. It's been in the pipeline now for the last 15 years. But there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It should be coming around next year. And it's going to be based on the model of you pass the exams on culture and language and you become equipped. But the fact is, having 30 hours and passing an exam is not going to help you communicate in the language. Yeah. And then because it's fairly new, there is no idea of respecting the child's culture. We have 30 children who have hitherto reached the Faroes this year in 2019. And they come in from ages 3 to 7 to 12, which means then it's difficult to anchor them in a system where Faroese is the language of education. So there is this complex issues. But I think the willingness of the immigrant parents and the children is more important than what the state does. And we all know immigration and integration is a two-way street. The immigrant has obligations and rights, and the government has obligations and rights. And I think we still haven't discovered that that's two-way street is important. So coming to our teachers, because I come from teacher education, we have not equipped teachers to become teachers of Faroese as a second language. The course should have been conducted last year, but funding was withdrawn because it was not thought it was that important. And so we have schools who are very, very frustrated. And as an immigrant, I'm often seen as someone who can cast light on the issue. I do not know why. So I'm puzzled because I'm in teacher education. So I'm often invited to parent-teacher meetings in the different municipalities. And you see frustrated parents who are very worried about their children's futures. And you see frustrated teachers who are not equipped to deal with these children in the classroom. So it's a question of balancing rights and obligations. It's a question of saying inclusion is important in every sense of the word if you want a Faroes that is ready for what we envisage the future to be. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. Very interesting and very special context in this. Yeah.
Yes. It's quite challenging, yeah.
Yes.
Challenging. It's very complex.
It is, yes. And they, when they come to school, what is their first language? Faroese?
Faroese. Faroese is the first language.
Okay.
Danish comes in grade 3.
3. Okay.
English in grade 4.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
So even, sorry.
Just a quick question. Do you have a low immigration rate? Because of these,
yeah.
they seem like a very high standard.
Yeah, 3% immigrants in 2019 up to now. No, up to June, sorry, up to June. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, what if a child which is about, for example, 10 years old, so he or she will enter the class 4, so
possibly class 3.
Or
because,
3.
Because
yeah.
they feel class 4 will be too much of a challenge linguistically.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So he or she will have to learn 2 languages at the same time, both Danish and Faroese.
Yeah.
And plus maintain their own language at home.
Yeah, and that's another thing. That's until recently the teachers were telling us that, you know, it's important for you to speak Faroese at home. To people like my husband and myself, we're both from India. If we spoke Faroese to our children, I don't know what they would have learned. So, so we refuse to do that. But that's because we have a knowledge of the pedagogy, of the theories behind second language acquisition and all of that. But then when you tell others who are not equipped the same way, they desperately try to send their children every evening to Faroese households, and then the family unit is breaking because they want exposure to Faroese outside school, and they can't give it as parents who have a different language.
So I still have one clarification.
Yes.
So the teaching is in Faroese.
Yes.
First 3 years.
No, right the way through it's in Faroese.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right the way through it's in
Yeah.
Faroese.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and this is thinking about, I've spent some time in Greenland, which of course it's the Danish system. But in Greenland, something like 80% of the educators, you know, start with the Greenlandic language. But to advance in and in your academic career past grade 10, you must learn Danish.
Yeah.
To go to university, you must
Absolutely.
learn Danish or English. But and this interesting challenge comes up because they also don't teach Greenlandic educators who are teaching the Greenlandic language. There's the teacher preparation is very different if it's somebody who's coming in just as the Greenlandic educator versus the regular educator who often is a Danish speaker, even though it's supposed to be a Greenlandic school. And I think so. I think there's this interesting. It's about the post-colonial or the ongoing colonial context that we're dealing with these language, and so the Faroese people are being so strong about retaining the language. I'm sure in part in response to, of course, what Denmark had done to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But perhaps then not also seeing what does this, if they sort of put themselves in the where were they 50 years ago with struggling with Denmark to say, no, we are allowed to retain our language. What does that look like? It doesn't give you an answer or any guideline, but I think it's an interesting issue that I think is coming up across the Arctic because we have so many people who are climate refugees from the south. I was interested this morning when the speaker spoke and she said, well, we have climate change and then we have hunger and we have these other things. And of course I look at all of those and say the conflicts that are driving people to the north are rooted as much in climate challenges as the geopolitical issues are because we have destroyed the ability of places to.
They're all interrelated.
They are. And so this is going to happen all over. I mean, we are a refugee resettlement community. We have I sit and look at out my window every day at a high school that has 80 languages spoken in it. 80.
80. Okay. 80.
Well, on average in Toronto, some of the high schools do have, one school where I was, I believe it was maybe 26 to 30 different languages.
Yeah.
In St. John's, in the largest high school, I think it's 31 languages.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
So do you have teaching English as a second language in both of your countries?
Yes. We have a very, they keep changing the name on it, but we do have a newcomer center that does an intensive immersion in English language for probably 30 hours. So I think a little bit more than that. And then there is teaching English as a second language at the schools, and it's a certificate for educators. But it doesn't mean that everybody's really getting access to it. And of course, the other challenge is that we have, and sort of foreshadowing what I was going to talk about a little bit, is that we have students who need English as a second language who are speaking heritage languages from our country, the indigenous languages. We have issue much in Alaska and Hawaii and some of our southern indigenous communities where people have grown up speaking a dialect that is, and also in our urban African American communities, they speak dialects of English that are identified negatively rather than seen as a legitimate dialect. And so those are also students who need English as a second language, but instead are put in special education.
So the programming in Canada is different from the US. I want to clarify our program.
Yes.
And our education system is quite different. So when a new family arrives, there is language training for the family, okay, so the family, and then what we've done in Newfoundland and other schools, as well as across Canada, is that there are situated schools that specialize in English as a second language. They have specialists, teacher specialists that work, as well as what we call Swiss workers, so they are social workers, as well as social development workers that work with the children and families to ensure that the families have what they need to be able to make the transition as needed. So that is something, and that's very, very specialized. We do have ESL specializations across Canada at most universities, whereas English is a second language as well as other language. Multilingualism is something that is quite current and is taught as a specialization at most universities. The challenges that we have right now that we find that are coming up in research again is Indigenous languages, also those of Canadian Indigenous peoples, wishing for those to become part of the curriculum. This is not a new thing for Canada because we've gone through this with Quebec, as you know, which is a language, their first language speaking is French, and as Canadians we recognize that. So although they are a part of Canada, they are very much still as a province that is focused in their first language, which is French. So a lot of our immersion programs are taught across Canada, so you can take French as a second language. Most high school students heading to university do French as a second and an immersion program, even though it's not a requirement for the actual final exam to get into university. I think it's more about having a second language, and Canadians, yes, French is our second language. So when we do have immigrants that come, there is a challenge there. If you live in the province of Quebec, but it's not so much elsewhere.
I might add as well, I might as well add, to be fair to the Faroe Islands as well, that they're starting a course. The policy is supposed to come later, and they've designed a course. There's an online course which helps you a little bit, but now they're designing a course based on the CFR European framework, which will take you through stages of language and what is acceptable and what you need to pass to be able to use the lawyers and doctors and mathematicians who are now perhaps working in menial jobs and things like that.
Oh yes,
that's a
huge
thing.
issue.
A huge aspect, because there's deep frustration for people, well-qualified people as well,
Yes.
who are there, because I think there's not a generic immigrant type. You have the whole spectrum. Naturally highly qualified people and people who are not, and then how do we teach language, and then we thought we'll go to the CFR system of teaching language, and that's something that we're looking forward to. But as a side note, it's interesting, if you go onto our tourism webpage, you have local Faroese people who have acted as translators. That is to say, the Faroes have become very important in tourism. So you have people writing in and saying, how do I say this? And you have a local Faroese person saying that sentence. So it's very interesting, because the language is small, and the Faroese are very good at being innovative in getting teaching their language in informal ways, and I think that's worth mentioning. Yeah.
We are still very challenged in Canada in teacher education programs and teaching English as a second language. I should say that. As you know, the Canadian government policy was to take in 20,000 new immigrants, and I believe it's closer to probably 35,000 that have come to Canada in the last 16 months. But as a result, there has been quite a lean on post-secondary education and the training of second language teachers. So that is a challenge. And I don't know about Finland.
Well, we do have teachers who have qualified to be teachers in Finnish as a second language, and I think that all the immigrant children who come to our comprehensive school will get that teaching. But it's only, for example, 2 lessons per week, so that's not enough. And they also have a possibility to, in some municipalities.
Okay, thank you.
Diane, please. Everything about that. Maybe with Diane we will continue about that.
Yes, it's actually quite related, and while we're putting up a map, I'll just say one of the other interesting challenges for us is with these really, if across our school district, 100 and some odd languages that are spoken, some of those languages are indigenous languages from, let's say, Mexico, where there is nobody who knows how to provide translation services. So it is this stressor of all of our social services, if you are coming in with those languages, let alone then having the school serve them. So it's an interesting challenge. I have this map up here because I think it's instructive for people to look. First of all, you can see how big Alaska is relative to all of North America. And then you see we have at least 20 different native languages that belong to 4 distinct language families. So meaning there's really, people cannot communicate across these languages, although there are these wonderful stories of, indigenous people who speak 4 or 5 of the different languages because of trading over the years. But the number of people who speak each of these languages varies enormously. We have some that have not, Eak down in the bottom, the last native speaker just passed away, although there are people who are studying because she provided her knowledge so that people could learn after she was gone. We have 2 fairly large languages. One of them is Yupik, which is that area you can see, central Yupik, and there's about that's the largest language. We have 10,000 speakers. And we have 17 communities in which children are growing up with that as their first language. So that is the strongest in Alaska. The second strongest would be the Inupiaq language, which is related to the Inuit language that goes across Canada and into Greenland and also over on the in Russia. And there's about 3,000 people who speak the Inupiaq language, but most of those are over the age of 40. So that becomes a threat to the language. And then there are speakers of the other languages you see, but in some cases there may be I think there's 4 native speakers of the Upper Kuskokwim language. So you see that large area and there's 4 people left who speak it as a first language. And then when you get into the Anchorage School District, which is in the middle of that Denina area, we have, it's the largest district. We have 48,000 students, as I said, over 100 languages. And the top 5 languages that are spoken at home other than English are Spanish, Hmong, Samoan, Filipino, and Korean. And then the largest indigenous language spoken there is Yupik. We have just opened the very first Yupik immersion program in the Anchorage School District in a public school. It's starting just with kindergarten, and then it'll go to first grade next year and go with the children as they advance. The school district for years has offered Spanish, Japanese, Russian, German, and Chinese language immersion programs. So, you know, we have privileged our world languages over our indigenous languages. And then around the state, there's a handful of schools that are Yupik immersion, one Tlingit immersion school, one Inupiaq immersion school, and then several districts that are now doing dual language immersion, so Yupik and English or Inupiaq and English. But there's a struggle with teachers. There's Yupik teachers are the most numerous because again the language is the strongest, but we are struggling with speakers of other languages. And it reminds me of some of the conversations about Finland and the Nordic countries where you have 3 Sami languages, but you definitely have one that is much more dominant than the other 2, and there are challenges in having educators and having materials that are available in those. And then we have the immigrants who are coming in again. So as I was talking about all those languages in Alaska, those 100 languages in Anchorage, yes, so probably, you know, several of them are the indigenous languages. And then there are the languages that come with people who've been there for a long time in some cases, Spanish and Filipino because they're in the fishing industry and have been residents for a long time. But then we have these brand new immigrants. So my question is, given this diversity of languages, and especially in our more urban areas, how do we not continue to lose the languages that are most vulnerable? And how do we manage to, you know, try to maintain these languages in educational settings that are, in particular in our state, in schools that are under-resourced and overburdened already? And so I'm hoping there's some thoughts I can bring back.
Yesterday evening I was thinking about this question, and I thought that, well, it sounds so rich.
Yes,
For starters.
it is.
So one could think that as a positive problem, for example. But I thought that is the school's instruction ever enough
Right.
to maintain the heritage or the endangered languages? So I thought that maybe something else should be done. For example, could society or schools or local authorities support the local communities so that they could develop activities and things, non-formal situations where you use the language, because I don't think that school instruction is ever enough. So for example, one of my graduate students developed a scout club in
Mhm.
Inarisame. So I think it's wonderful. And there were huge problems in, for example, because wolves are so hated in reindeer herding, so they had
Yes.
to invent a new name for that. But
Oh, not cubs.
yeah,
Yes.
things like that. But anyway, I thought that one solution might be that to pay more attention to the local communities and the non-formal ways of using language. Mm.
I wondered about elders.
Mhm.
You know, encouraging Canada and Indigenous and Northern communities. It's only now that we're starting to, I mean, they've always said the importance of elders and caregivers and acknowledge that. But I think it's only now that Canadian government, as well as institutions such as universities,
Mhm.
are seeing the importance of that ancestral knowledge being shared.
Yes.
So at Memorial University, we have elders that come and hold sessions with teachers so that they understand what is a way and what forward that we can sit and have a conversation that allows for us to get to know each other. So we have sort of a situation where elders and teachers sit together like this at the same table, rather than the teacher being the one to basically the one who has the knowledge.
Mhm.
So that knowledge sharing we've seen to be most important, and it's very community related. It's drawing on their own experiences and wondering how teachers can see that, understand it to be more valuable than they see it. I mean, with young teachers, a lot of them are very much acquainted with social media, which is wonderful in many ways.
Mhm.
Digital media allows for them to draw on all kinds of
Yes.
different resources, but one resource we find they're not great at is talking.
I was also going to suggest about those podcasts and radio channels and so on,
Yeah.
which I used also, but talking is quite strong.
Yes.
But it's not only a matter of translating. It's more like with this wolf in the
Yeah.
sculpting, it can't be in Sami context. So it's not about translating with Google Translate. So
Right.
it's much more about being aware of the culture and identity, and that's important.
Sensitivity
Yeah.
in culture. True.
Yeah. And that's the thing I was thinking of as well. How much of awareness we can raise about the community before we can interest the powers that be
Right.
to make a positive contribution
Right.
to that which they should. Because the people are any country's greatest resource.
Yes.
And it's a sheer waste of resource, I think, and the dignity of the human being to just let them go without giving that special interest.
Right.
And what it requires to be a part, to have that ownership of, and be proud of who you are
Yes.
and where you come from.
And I think it goes back to, again, the challenge with the legacy of colonization is that we do, we have a lot of people for whom the school is a traumatic place. And even though we're now down maybe a couple of generations, our last boarding schools closed, our last involuntary boarding schools closed in the 70s. So it's not that long ago. And, we had schools that some of were fairly positive experiences and some of which rival some of the residential schools that you hear about in Canada for the abuses, unfortunately. And we have educators who don't understand how to work collaboratively the way you're describing, and so there are elders who don't want to walk into the school or will only come if they are paid to be in the school, and then in other places there really is this linking. But I think some of it is there has to be a conversation with communities and educators about how do we make this work.
Yes, because I think in many ways educators do not understand the tragedy of residential schools in Canada. Some of the research we've been doing with teacher inquiry groups across Canada is looking at the use of children's picture books that share these historical moments. They're written in ways that children understand, but also in ways where elders can come in and talk about why it's so hard for them to be in the school and why they don't like schooling and why they've never really wanted their children to go to school because of these experiences. One of the most I guess in our research in Canada, we found that this also gave the opportunity for parents of parents who were in residential schools and grandparents to come to schools when they did projects around residential schools to talk about what happened. So it's been very much a chance for reconciliation and understanding and healing.
Yes.
Because they have not gone into schools, and now they come and they share what they feel comfortable about, and we have a better understanding.
You know, we have a new public television show. It's an animated cartoon called Molly of Denali, and it stars an Athabascan young, the main character, and her grandfather, who talked about what happened to him in boarding schools, and you know, there's educational materials being provided to schools to use this, because even if it was different potentially from different communities, this still gives that opening, and
It does, and I think it's important, but the other part too that we have found with teachers is we want them to understand that Indigenous people are very successful, have had wonderful lives, and have made wonderful contribution. So starting with something that is so tragic, even though it's a historical period, we try to get teachers to look at more successful, examples, and to celebrate first, and then to maybe return to those moments that need to explain why there's still pain. Like in Canada, 65% of the population of Indigenous people are very successful. It's the other part of the population that still struggles in places in my northern province, which is continually in the news because of, unfortunately, mental health illness and as a result of residential schools. But there is great success to be celebrated.
But I think that coming back to what Suvi said about the richness, I was
Yes.
also thinking about that maybe we should concentrate on these good examples and how successful lives people have, and what the richness it is to
Yes.
have 80 languages in
Yes.
one school.
Yes.
I found that very actually amazing.
yes,
And if we do education well, those young people learn to celebrate the diversity, and they learn to kind of find the strengths from themselves rather than looking the bad things. And media is of course always interested only,
Yes.
as you
Yeah.
said.
And maybe
in that.
and maybe school could support the richness of languages by
Yes.
showing it some way, like
yes,
just
yes.
putting tags or tables or
Yes.
Different languages in
different
class.
languages. Yeah.
I have something very similar to that. The school, which I described with the 31 languages where at the city where I'm from, they have a sign outside the school. It's a sign that announces, what is coming up in the school. So parents, when they go by, they see the announcements, and it has a big heart, huge heart, and it says 31 languages, one heart.
Yes, that's really nice.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
That's a kind of
A
really
positive, positive reinforcement and a
Yeah.
positive message.
And our
Yeah.
cultural organizations, our local museum celebrates languages from the Diane language of the people of the region in Anchorage, which is all over, but also regularly has exhibits that bring in the cultures of the new people. And we are, as a municipality, we are part of the Welcoming America initiative. So we have a Welcoming Anchorage initiative that is for immigrants and refugees, but we've added Indigenous peoples from rural Alaska and LGBTQ, because we have a wonderful mayor and first lady, and so at least for now, Anchorage has become that place. But the schools are still a struggle, and that's what's interesting, is that the cultural and the community,
It's very accepting.
yes, and then have the schools be getting there. But it's part of it is our schooling model. I want everybody to come to Finland and hear the conversations here, and then we can go back and
You
have
can
open
always
classrooms.
You can always
Yes.
use the recording.
Yes.
I just want to say that I think language and identity are so closely knit.
Yes.
That's right.
And if you can't respect the mother tongue of an individual, you do damage.
Yeah.
There is no looking away from that.
Yes.
As be it Indigenous peoples, be it immigrants, I think respect for for one's language and how close it is to one's identity cannot be ignored, either in informal education or in formal education.
Yeah.
I think that's key, that respect that you give.
I agree.
Yeah,
Yes,
I think
yes.
it's extremely important.
And the richness of the knowledge contained in that language.
Thank you. Thank you. And then,
Okay.
Suvi, please.
Okay, so I have a little bit different angle approaching do you speak my language, because it's about understanding a child or a young person, because they are always not able to express themselves for starters. But I was thinking that as adults in schools, how do we or the teachers or other people understand children's or young people's talk? Do we hear the speech of a child or a young person, and do we, for example, remember to ask, how are you? Or do we just pass the child's knowledge in a way? And this is related to some of the research that we have been doing in, for example, escalated child protection cases, where the children's knowledge or child's knowledge is passed or not heard somehow, and the child welfare personnel and the teachers, they haven't been able to identify the emerging problems in good time, for example. So I was wondering about these kinds of questions, that what are the reasons for the difficulties in detecting students' ill-being or misery when it comes to, for example, home and family issues, and could the child's or young person's voice or knowledge be heard somehow? What would be the key topics or competence for teachers, or what kinds of approaches do we need to accomplish these kinds of problems?
I think the teacher education system in the Faroe Islands has a very key area, particularly in the social educators education, where they are equipped to deal, to use the child's ability to communicate, to be sensitive to change in behavior, to know how to cope with it, and at least to know where else you need to go if it's beyond your remit. So that is a very clear focus in our department. I'm aware of that. And the next thing, of course, is listening to the child. And I have to say this is a personal experience. I got a call from my son's kindergarten saying, "Could you please come and pick him up? He's not feeling so well." And I said, "All right." And I go in there, and he hasn't been able to tell his nursery teachers what the problem was. And I go in there, and he's standing like this. My husband and I go. He said, "Don't touch me." I said, "What's going on, darling?" And he says, "No, they've been licking me thinking I'm made of chocolate." And he was too embarrassed to tell his nursery teacher. He said, "Because they're not brown like me, they might not understand." Right, so the parents are brown, and therefore we share a language and an identity. So this was in 92, 93. They were licking him because he thought he was made of chocolate. You know, sorry.
It's very sad.
It's very sweet.
It would be interesting to hear how did you deal with that. But
Well, I was just, and so we have one of the initiatives that Anchorage has been at the forefront of and is nationally recognized is social emotional learning. And this very strong recognition that children and the adults need to be in a place where they can access knowledge and all that. So so there's been extensive professional development for our teachers, school administrators, and it's infused in our teacher education programs more or less. And mindfulness is the other concept that is in other parts of the U.S. maybe a little stronger because we're very SEL, that's social emotional learning, but they're quite related. And so I think And I have been in schools with children coming from very difficult circumstances, serving very low income children with a lot of violence and other issues. And the administrators have talked about the difference that they have seen, because you're giving children tools for self-regulation, for conflict resolution, as well as I've noticed a reduction in tension amongst the teachers. And that the teachers can function better when they're having conflict as well as the children, and that really helps.
In Canada, we have a huge concern with social emotional regulation with children. We see a changing of families. Children sometimes live in two homes, are shared between, mom and dad's house. Families don't necessarily have the same supports because they don't live in the hometown where their parents may be. So we're finding that children are really struggling sometimes in schools. And we find teachers are not coping well with knowing what to do, because we don't necessarily train teachers as well to recognize that. They're very often wanting to be responsive to the child, but unsure what to do. So we're looking a little bit more at those particular programs, but a lot of it is around the emotional needs of the child as being, something that needs to be addressed more in schools, and an understanding of that. We have a higher incidence of ADHD, which is attention deficit disorder, but also children who are being diagnosed by teachers as having ADHD, but they don't. They're children who just want to play. So we're really active. So we do have some problems, and we have parents who are struggling, not knowing how to cope or to talk to their children or to understand them. What happens is, because they rely on the expertise of professionals all the time, children are being not listened to. Instead of talking to children and asking them to draw a picture about what you're feeling, to explain. There's also the idea that it's protective, that children are continuously in danger. That children cannot protect themselves, and children cannot speak for themselves. So that's a problem.
They might be loyal to their parents, for example. And there's a problem, because we cannot expect that the teachers should be social workers or psychologists and so on. But when it comes to multi-professional teamwork, so that's a problem also, because it, for example, in Finland, I think that in many cases, the different professionals, they just do their side of the work. They might have some meeting where are many people, and then they say, okay, I take this piece and you take that piece. But in the long run, it longers the processes, and the problems, they are not detected in early stage. So
there's too many. The teachers in Canada are expected to be experts of everything. And instead, in a school, we need all of these experts to come together, not once, but to work together all the time. So in Canada, we do not have occupational therapists in schools. That's a big one, right? Because we know children who don't reach a certain phase in their life where they are being able to be regulated in that way, have later problems learning. So that's one. So we don't have speech pathologists in the school. Okay? So because we don't have these specialists stationed in schools all the time, then the problems are not always addressed as they should be. So it's a concern, because we're finding more and more children are being medicated with medicine, because the teacher says to the parent, this child is not listening, this child can't sit still. And I say that because I have a little boy who can't sit still. But he doesn't have ADHD. What he has is energy. And he needs to play and be engaged more, right? So that's how I sort of look at, in his growing up and what happened with my son, right? So anyway.
Yeah.
And I just reminded me about Reggio Emilia and how 100 language of children. So
That's
children
right.
have
Yeah.
those 100 language different ways of expressing themselves, and we take away 99 and give them
Right.
only one, which is the
Yes.
speaking way of telling things.
Yeah.
And if we talk about socio-emotional things, it's not always to get words for those. Not even for us adults when we are emotional or angry. It's not easy just to calm down and explain to someone how you feel. No way.
Yeah, and especially for small children.
Yeah. It's even harder.
Yeah. We just wrote an article about how do young people perceive the school as a supporter of their well-being, and one of the suggestions was that there could be many kinds of non-formal situations where we could, for example, play different kinds of games with a youth worker, for example, so that it would be nice to have a person that you are familiar with, and then if sometimes the problems may occur, so I would have a reliable adult where to go to. So that was the young person's
It's more the
people's
community.
And we
Creating avenues of trust, as we
Yes.
call them, right?
And we do have initiatives around wraparound services or school community partnerships where we do actually try to, in some places, embed social services in the campus, particularly when you have concentrations, both of poverty and just of large numbers. I was thinking, we have speech language pathologists, we have occupational therapists, except if you're in most of those rural and remote communities, they might be there once every 2 weeks. And that's if the plane can get in because the weather's good. So it is also so different from the urban areas where you have a wealth of resources.
Yeah, that's one problem too.
But we are seeing, and I know this from this Arctic Youth Project we're doing, that we're seeing this across the North, mental health issues are just really growing. And I'm, how much of it is that we're finally diagnosing them, and how much of it is that we've created these stressors that are escalating these issues for young people. And I fear that it's less about good diagnoses and more that we are really creating a generation of children who are traumatized.
Yes, and in particular in the Canada North area, we have a lot of incidents of suicide
Yes.
with youth, which is very much in the international news.
Yes.
So we're trying to youth workers and having people to work within the communities, elders, but they've come to depend on the elders so much that often they just can't continue to do the work. It's very hard. So we need to find other supports in place. So for them so we've put in social media where they can contact a counselor and speak with them. We have digital storytelling where they can actually talk about and celebrate what their culture is about. But a lot of it is social emotional that has gone on and has not been addressed. So, and it's a concern because schools are not equipped with people. They have teachers trying to do it all and they burn out and they don't stay.
Yes.
And then when you have an expert, for example, a psychologist, he or she can only concentrate to that one child which has problems.
Yes.
So it would be so nice to, in early stage, for example, come to a class, a group of students, and start working with them in a preventive way, for example, so that they could be there could be a better atmosphere in that group, for example, so that someone
because that's difficult sometimes. And I was in a classroom visiting a teacher who was just doing her first teaching placement, and she said to me, the children are very active and have a lot of problems. And I thought to myself, So I think what the problem was is that if you had someone, a specialist like that, working with the teacher in the classroom, they would say these are not problems.
Yeah, that's right.
These are ways in which children are trying to communicate with each other, but may not quite have the language and don't know how, and are just looking for attention. So they don't recognize these things. It's when the older teachers say, that's okay, you know, but they don't have that mentorship or the specialization.
Yes.
So that would be much better. Yeah.
Do you speak my language? Stop and listen.
Yeah.
Mm.
I
Stop
think
and
that,
listen.
yes, I think that's a very good.
Yeah, I think that's what
Yeah,
professionals
yes.
ought to stop and listen.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
And
just
you'll
give,
hear. Yeah.
just give time
Yes.
for the
Mhm.
children and the young people to be heard.
Yeah, and find different ways to for them. It can be art, or it can be
Yes.
play, or it can be online tools used in small communities in the north. If the social worker or at school is your family friend, it's not easy to go to them.
Yeah.
I have some problems or something.
Yeah.
But the digital means, as you said, and social media, the ways that young people communicate.
And reach out to each
Yeah.
other. We're seeing
Yeah.
more of that, but we need to sort of make sure, I think, that someone in the community at the school also is part of that. Currently, right now in Canada, I mean, that person is the guidance counselor.
Mhm.
Where will you go to university? What will you study?
Right.
Or in the younger grades, only for children who have severe problems. You know, so that person is not getting out to get to know the children and spend a day in the classroom and understanding there may be something that I can help them with. So we need, in Canada, teachers, we need to understand that the multi-professional approach, which you said earlier, I think is the way that schools need to be seen. You know?
And then cycling back to where you started, also, I know one of the really successful suicide prevention efforts in Nunavik was around getting young men back out into learning about subsistence and in learning the traditional practices of how you
The
bring your
land.
first catch to an elder, and then they had to learn how to talk to that elder, and then they brought in food for the community food bank, and so they saw themselves as having a role in that community, you know, reestablishing I am responsible and there's protocol.
Yes,
Yeah.
and a connection to the land again, the
Yeah.
identity. Yeah, that's really nice.
It's a powerful model, and you know, and then it is not just the school.
Yes.
Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you.
And now we are ready for any comments or questions from the audience you might have in your mind. Yes, please.
Yes.
My name is Diane. I'm from Old University. I'm from Old University. My research is about indigenous education, but in Indonesian context, so it's more like equatorial context. Our condition maybe not as advanced, like not most of the language of our indigenous people are still spoken language. They don't have written language. So I found a little bit, it's very difficult for us to engage, collaborate with the formal education setting because we don't have anything like study materials and everything. But then I learned through books the case in many polar area.
Yes.
Then I noticed that it's very important to have written language or written pedagogic or written study materials. So in my case, I don't know whether this can contribute, but in my case, at the end, I changed my plan. So I would like to do like a participatory action research to develop. So me with the community, we would like to develop like materials, study materials written in their language.
Yes.
About because with the indigenous, they don't separate knowledge like natural science, social science.
Right.
They all integrated.
Right.
So we will talk about like natural resource management. So we will talk like how to reach sustainable natural resource management. So we would like to do this participatory action research So at the end we will have like this written study material within their language, and so they can like because I don't have the face like there is no written language which the school can use. So with this kind of face, so the community can has like written language and also study materials in the same time, and they will collaborate directly like this like in one phase. So they also will collaborate with the school, so it's like for the community that doesn't have this kind of
So Diane, you probably might have more experience.
Well, actually, I know of an example from Washington State with one of the tribes there that what they've done is had children go out and interview elders actually for traditional stories. But the traditional stories, of course, are ways of transmitting knowledge. And so it's an assignment for the students to write this up and then illustrate it. And then that becomes the text materials for the next generation of learners. And so it's a way for elders to share their wisdom without, and it's done in a very respectful way. So it's absolutely that building the curriculum from within the community rather than from outside. Because I do have a friend who did a project with translating classics of children's literature into indigenous languages, which is nice, but the indigenous folks said, no, the stories, I may love those stories because I grew up on them, but they don't make sense in that context. You need the stories from within the community.
To be able to do it. So there are two examples in Canada. One is of the written culture. So there has been a study that has been completed where they have translated Innu language into, Times Roman numeral into English, where they're starting to write their own history in their own language. So that's one example that's going on, and I can give you the details after about that, so that might be very helpful to you. There's a Canadian research chair. It's a person who has a specialization. I believe our friend is one of them that's on our committee, or that would be from the University of Saskatchewan or maybe Regina. So I can get that name for you. The other one is the Multi-Literacies Project. The Multi-Literacies Project is situated at the University of York. I think it's at York University now. What they did there was they did dual language texts, very successful. Children wrote a story with their parents in their own language, and then it was translated into English. The dual text is they're done in digital, so we have one side that's written in their first language and then translated to the English on the side. The page turns over, we see an equity of language because the story is told in that way. But I think your question pertains to written language that's does not formally have a formal alphabet or a way in which it to be. So maybe we could talk after. Okay.
And one of the learnings when I finally went through the list of all of the languages in the Anchorage School District was how many were languages from Micronesia and Indonesia, so that there's only a couple of speakers, it's just one or two families came and their children are in the schools now, but we do actually have faculty from there in our philosophy department, so that may be somebody that I can connect you with as well. Yes.
Any other comments or questions?
Well,
Yes.
thank you for your interesting conversation. I was thinking about the global issues today in Finland and I think all over the world about this climate change and everything concerning that. But is it a threat or is it a possibility for the cultures and the languages? Also in Finland, I'm thinking about after we have also this until the 30s, 40s. What is happening? What is it a threat or is it a possibility or a threat?
I think that we come to that what Suvi said about richness. If we welcome the diverse culture and different languages then I think it's a richness and adds to our local communities. But if we think that they are threat, then then it becomes a problem, really.
But if,
And you know, in Finland, they just recently offered one of the Sami languages as distance learning to all over Finland, and it was funded by the Ministry of Education and Culture, wasn't it? And they were so surprised because it raised so much interest, and there were so many students that were not Sami people that wanted to learn that language because it was available. So in that sense, it's not a threat.
Yes, I think it's a big thing.
but I will say, if I think about what's happening with climate change and globalization, our languages, those 20 languages, are so tied to the land and the meaning. And when you have elders who say, I don't know how to read the ice anymore, so they're finding that the words that they have don't work anymore because the land is changing so rapidly. It's heartbreaking. It is really heartbreaking. And then when people are having to move their communities because the land is no longer stable, it also means that the place that the language is tied to the land and they cannot be on that land. So we really do have a crisis.
I think we do. I mean, I a lot of the theoretical work I look at and I write about is multiliteracies, and the arguments very early on for multiliteracies, and then that particular theoretical framework was the idea of multiple Englishes, but the idea that English was the dominant language, and that we see it being used more and more as becoming a language of communication. It's a huge concern about how this is overtaking and is really overshadowing Indigenous languages and how they're being learned, experienced, taught. I think when we look at equity and issues around equity and we're seeing a little bit more of a focus in that area. And also I think that when we look at globalization, I'm not really sure if people really understand what is completely going on. I think it's only now that people are starting to realize, like, oh wait, now everything is becoming English, which is worrisome.
English, as
Yeah.
you say. Yes. Just a couple of thoughts here. I think that as educators and researchers, we probably should think that what is the school in community and how we bring up the belonging, the feeling of belonging, so that children and young people feel that I belong here, or this school or this institution belongs here to our community, and they work together. I think that is something we can look after, and also then the language and identity, and how important it is, as Kalpana said, to respect the language, the first language or the family language, and how it builds your identity. And then children and young people, they build their own identity. They have their own. For example, I was living in Australia, so my son has his Finnish identity, but then he also had his Australian kind of identity at school, and now he's very kind of her own creature. I think your kids as well. So it's we should support that identity work and celebrate different languages and understand how important they are for their families. And then the Finnish, I would like to follow what you said, that do you speak my language? Stop and listen. Yes. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much.